and a small clutch in hand. Though she didn't wear the extravagant jewelry or designer labels flaunted by many of the other guests, she carried herself with a dignity that turned heads. After all, she had spent decades navigating a world that often judged her by the color of her skin before anything else. The hostess led her to a table near the corner of the room, slightly removed from the bustling center. Mrs. Carter didn't mind. She preferred a quieter spot where she could observe the room without being the center of attention. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the restaurant. The patrons were a mix of old money and new, business tycoons, socialites, and a few celebrities who sought discretion. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black vests moved gracefully between tables, their movements rehearsed and efficient. Each table seemed to receive impeccable service. Her expression unchanged. She was no stranger to being overlooked or dismissed. Still, she believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps James was simply busy, she thought. She decided to wait a little longer. However, as the minutes dragged on, it became increasingly clear that James was deliberately avoiding her table. She watched as he served other guests, his demeanor polite and professional. When he passed her table again, she spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her tone carrying a quiet authority. James stopped, his back stiffening. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Yes?" he asked, his voice clipped. "I've been waiting for some time now," Mrs. Carter said. "Could you please bring me a menu?" James hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He glanced around the room, as if hoping someone else would intervene. When no one did, he sighed and stepped closer to her table. But instead of fetching a menu, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. He said, his tone dripping with condescension. Carter said nothing, her gaze steady on James. She had faced prejudice before, but it never ceased to sting. Still, she refused to let him see her hurt. Instead, she straightened her posture and met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I am exactly where I intend to be," she replied. Her voice was measured, but there was steel beneath her words. "Now, people like you don't belong here. This is a place for class, for people who know how to act and look the part. Maybe you should try somewhere else." Nearby diners began to notice the exchange. Carter remained composed, though her heart ached at the blatant disrespect. She had spent her life building something meaningful, breaking barriers and proving her worth in a world that often sought to diminish her. And yet, here she was, being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of a young man who knew nothing of her story. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" James turned, his expression shifting from smugness to unease. Standing behind him was Daniel Carter, the restaurant's manager. Daniel was in his mid-30s, with sharp features and an air of authority. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his presence commanding respect. "No problem, sir," James said quickly, straightening his posture. "I was just—" "Daniel," Mrs. Carter interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Daniel's eyes shifted to his mother, and his expression softened instantly. "Mother," he said, his tone filled with warmth and concern. "What's going on?" James froze, his mind struggling to process the word. "Mother?" he thought, his stomach sinking. He looked between Mrs. Carter and Daniel, his face draining of color. Daniel turned to James, his expression hardening. "This is my mother," he said, his voice cold and precise. "And the owner of this restaurant." The room fell silent. Patrons who had been watching the exchange now stared openly, their curiosity turning to shock. James's face turned a deep shade of red as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. I didn't know," James stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry." But Daniel raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll discuss this later," he said curtly. "For now, you're dismissed." James nodded quickly, his head bowed in shame as he hurried away. The room remained quiet, the tension palpable. Mrs. Carter watched him go, her expression unreadable. Daniel turned back to his mother, his voice softening once more. "Are you all right?" he asked. Mrs. Carter gave him a small smile, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "I'm fine," she said. "But we have much to talk about." The restaurant, once alive with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of fine silverware, now seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on Mrs. Eleanor Carter and her son, Daniel. "I can't believe this happened. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Carter raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of years of experience, of battles fought and lessons learned. She had seen this kind of prejudice before, and while it no longer surprised her, it never ceased to disappoint. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced James earlier, "this isn't the first time I've been treated this way. And it won't be the last. But what matters now is how you handle it." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "I'll fire him," he said firmly. "Effective immediately. He has no place here." Mrs. Carter studied her son for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. She could see the anger in his eyes, the protective instinct that had always been a part of him. But she also knew that anger alone wouldn't solve anything. If James left without understanding the gravity of his actions, the lesson would be lost. Firing him might be the easiest solution. She said, her tone measured, "But is it the right one?" Daniel frowned, confused. "He disrespected you, Mother. He humiliated you in front of everyone. How can I let him stay after that?" Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Sometimes," she said, "the people who need to learn the hardest lessons are the ones who make the biggest mistakes. If you fire him now, he'll leave angry and bitter, blaming me for his downfall. But if you make him face what he's done, truly face it, then maybe, just maybe, he'll come out of this a better person." Daniel hesitated, torn between his desire to protect his mother and his respect for her wisdom. He had always admired her ability to see the bigger picture, to find the teachable moment even in the most painful experiences. But this was different. This was personal. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "Because if you want him gone, I'll make it happen." Mrs. Carter smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "I trust you to do what's best, Daniel. You've always had a good heart. Just remember, respect and dignity are not just for the people who deserve it. They are for everyone." Daniel nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He knew she was right, even if it wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. Taking a deep breath, he stood and straightened his jacket. "I'll handle it," he said. "But first, let me get you something to eat. You've been waiting long enough." Mrs. Carter chuckled, the tension in the room easing slightly. "I would appreciate that," she said. "And maybe a glass of wine, too. It's been quite the evening." As Daniel walked away, the other diners gradually returned to their meals, though the buzz of whispered conversations lingered in the air. Mrs. Carter could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity palpable. She ignored them, her focus on the larger picture. Tonight wasn't just about her. It was about challenging the kind of ignorance that had led James to treat her the way he had. And if she could help Daniel turn this into a moment of growth, for James, for the staff, and for the restaurant as a whole, then it would be worth it. In the staff room, James sat on a worn leather couch, his head in his hands. His mind raced with a mixture of shame, fear, and confusion. He had thought he was doing well at this job, impressing his managers and earning the respect of his co-workers. But now, all of that seemed to crumble around him. How could he have been so stupid? So blind? The door opened, and James looked up to see Daniel standing in the doorway. His boss's expression was unreadable. And that made James's stomach churn even more. "Come with me," Daniel said simply, his tone giving no room for argument. James stood, his legs shaky, and followed Daniel through the back hallways of the restaurant. They emerged into a small private dining room, where Mrs. Carter was now seated with a glass of wine in hand. But he obeyed. As he sat down, he avoided Mrs. Carter's gaze, his shame too great to face her directly. "Do you know who this is?" Daniel asked, his voice cold. James nodded weakly. "Yes, she's your mother. And the owner. And do you understand what you did tonight?" Daniel continued, his tone growing sharper. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. I disrespected her. I made assumptions. I was wrong." Mrs. Carter leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. "Why?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Why did you think it was acceptable to treat me that way?" James hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I don't know," he admitted finally. "I guess I thought you didn't belong here." "And why is that?" Mrs. Carter pressed. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it demanded honesty. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Because you didn't look like the other guests," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "And what does that tell you about yourself?" she asked. James's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the question. He had expected anger, condemnation, even dismissal. "Everyone has a lot to learn," she said softly. "The question is, you willing to do the work?" James nodded quickly, his desperation clear. "Yes," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "Apologies are a start," she said. "But actions speak louder than words. If you truly want to make amends, you need to start by examining your own prejudices and challenging them. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward." Daniel watched the exchange in silence. It was a reminder of why she had always been his greatest role model. "James," Daniel said finally, his tone firm but fair, "you're not fired. But you're on probation. Starting tomorrow. You'll attend a series of training sessions on diversity and inclusion. And you'll report directly to me until I'm satisfied that you've learned from this experience. Understood?" James nodded quickly, relief washing over him. "Yes, sir. Thank you. I won't let you down." Mrs. Carter offered him a faint smile. "Remember," she said, "it's not about proving yourself to us. It's about becoming the kind of person you can be proud of." James nodded again, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. As he left the room, he felt a strange mix of shame and hope. He had been given a second chance, one he didn't deserve but was determined to make the most of. As Daniel returned to his mother's table, he let out a long breath. "You always know how to handle these situations," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Mrs. Carter smiled, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Years of practice," she said. "Now, let's enjoy this meal. I'm starving." Daniel laughed, the tension finally breaking. As the waiter brought out their food, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But the lesson of the evening lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the power of respect, dignity, and the willingness to change. The next morning, the restaurant was quiet as the staff trickled in. And everyone was on edge, unsure of what it would mean for the team moving forward. James arrived early, his uniform freshly pressed and his face set with determination. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the scene over and over again. The shame of his actions gnawed at him, but beneath that shame was a flicker of resolve. He had been given a second chance, one he didn't deserve, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of it. As he stepped into the staff room, the conversations around him quieted. His co-workers avoided his gaze, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. James felt the weight of their stares but didn't let it deter him. He had made a mistake. And now it was his responsibility to face the consequences. Daniel entered a few minutes later, his presence commanding immediate attention. He carried a clipboard and wore the same no-nonsense expression he had the night before. Without preamble, he addressed the team. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Before we start the day, I want to address what happened last night. As many of you know, one of our staff members acted in a way that was completely unacceptable. Discrimination, in any form, has no place in this restaurant, or anywhere else, for that matter." He paused, letting his words sink in. The staff shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward James, who stood silently at the back of the room. "James has acknowledged his mistake," Daniel continued, "and he has committed to learning from it. Starting today, we'll be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff members. This isn't just about what happened last night, it's about creating a culture of respect and understanding. One where everyone feels welcome and valued." There were murmurs of agreement, though a few employees exchanged skeptical glances. James felt a flush of embarrassment but kept his head high. Elena prided herself on her professionalism and her ability to handle even the most difficult guests. But Mrs. Carter's grace and dignity had struck a chord with her, forcing her to confront her own blind spots. During a quiet moment in the middle of the lunch rush, Elena approached James at the service station. He was refilling a water pitcher, his movements precise and deliberate. "Hey," she said, her voice hesitant. James looked up, surprised. "Hey?" Elena shifted awkwardly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. The team began to see him not just as someone trying to make amends, but as a person genuinely committed to becoming better. Tonight, Mrs. Carter was back, and this time, she wasn't just a guest. She was hosting a dinner for a group of prominent community leaders, business owners, educators, activists, and artists. The event was a celebration of diversity and inclusion, a testament to the values that Mrs. Carter had championed throughout her life. It was also a chance for the restaurant to showcase the progress it had made since that pivotal night. James had volunteered to take charge of the event. It was a daunting task, but he saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate his growth, not just to Mrs. Carter, but to himself. He had spent weeks preparing, working closely with the kitchen staff, the management team, and even the decorators to ensure that every detail was perfect. James greeted each one with a warm smile and a genuine sense of hospitality. He moved through the room with ease, his demeanor confident but humble. When Mrs. Carter entered, flanked by her friends, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "Thank you, James. It's good to see you again." James led her and her party to their table, ensuring that every detail was just right. As he poured their wine, he couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. This moment, this opportunity to serve Mrs. Carter with the respect and dignity she deserved, felt like a small but meaningful step toward redemption. The dinner progressed smoothly, each course a masterpiece of culinary artistry. The guests laughed and chatted, their conversations ranging from light-hearted anecdotes to deep discussions about the challenges and triumphs of building a more inclusive world. James moved through the room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, ensuring that everything ran seamlessly. At one point, Mrs. Carter called him over to her table. James's heart raced as he approached, unsure of what to expect. "James," she said, her tone warm but serious, "I want to thank you for everything you've done tonight. This dinner is flawless, and it's clear that you've put a lot of thought and care into making it special." James felt a flush of pride but quickly shook his head. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. But the credit belongs to the whole team. I couldn't have done it without them." Mrs. Carter's smile widened. "Humility suits you, James. But don't sell yourself short. I can see the effort you've put into this, and it means a lot, not just to me, but to everyone here." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It was the least I could do," he said. "After what happened, I wanted to show you that I've learned from my mistakes." Mrs. Carter reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "And you have," she said softly. "But remember, James, Growth isn't about erasing the past. It's about using it to build a better future. And from what I've seen tonight, you're well on your way. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel stood to address the room. He tapped his glass lightly with a fork, the gentle chime drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a mix of pride and emotion, "thank you all for being here tonight. This dinner is more than just a celebration, it's a reminder of the power of growth, understanding, and community. And it's a testament to the incredible woman who inspired it, my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Carter." The room erupted into applause as Mrs. Carter stood, her expression one of quiet gratitude. She raised her glass, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for sharing this evening with me. And thank you for believing in the importance of what we're building together. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And it starts with each of us, in the choices we make and the way we treat one another." Her eyes found James, and she smiled. "Tonight, I've seen what's possible when we choose growth over judgment, understanding over fear, and kindness over indifference. And for that, I am deeply grateful." James felt a lump rise in his throat as the room filled with applause once more. He looked around at the faces of his co-workers, his guests, and Mrs. Carter, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was on the right path. And that, he realized, was enough. After the dinner ended and the guests began to leave, James stayed behind to help clean up. As he worked, Mrs. Carter approached him, her steps unhurried and her expression thoughtful. "James," she said, her voice soft but firm, "may I have a word?" James set down the tray he was holding and turned to face her. "Of course, Mrs. Carter." She studied him for a moment, her gaze kind but penetrating. "You've come a long way," she said finally. "I can see how much effort you've put into changing, and I want you to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed." James felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot coming from you." Mrs. Carter nodded. "But remember, James," she continued, "this is just the beginning. Growth is a lifelong journey, and there will always be more to learn, more to understand, and more to give. Don't let tonight be the end of your efforts. Let it be the foundation for something even greater." James nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. "I won't forget," he said. "And I won't stop trying." Mrs. Carter smiled, a sense of purpose settling over him. He had made mistakes, big ones, but he had also taken steps to make things right. And as he looked around the restaurant that had become more than just a workplace, he realized that he wasn't alone in his journey. Together, they were building something stronger, something better. And that, he thought, was worth everything. Months passed, and the restaurant thrived in ways no one had anticipated. It wasn't just the food or the luxurious ambience that drew people in, it was the atmosphere of warmth, respect, and inclusivity that had taken root. The staff, once a group of individuals working side by side, had grown into a cohesive team, bound by shared values and a commitment to growth. He continued to educate himself, attending workshops, reading books, and seeking out conversations that challenged his perspectives. He had become a quiet leader among the staff, not through authority but through example. His humility and willingness to admit his mistakes inspired others to do the same, creating a ripple effect that transformed the culture of the restaurant. One afternoon, Daniel called a meeting with the entire staff. The dining room was empty, the tables bare, as the team gathered to hear what he had to say. Daniel stood at the front of the room, his expression serious but hopeful. "I wanted to take a moment to reflect on how far we've come," he began, his voice steady. "This restaurant has always been a place of excellence." Letting his words sink in, the staff exchanged glances, their faces lighting up with pride. "But there's one person I want to recognize in particular," Daniel continued. "Someone who took a hard look at himself, acknowledged his mistakes, and worked tirelessly to make things right. James, would you come up here?" The room broke into applause as James stepped forward, his cheeks flushing with surprise. He hadn't expected this, hadn't sought it, but the recognition filled him with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Daniel placed a hand on James's shoulder. James. It wasn't just a moment of recognition, it was a turning point, a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he could go. That evening, as the restaurant buzzed with activity, Mrs. Carter made another visit. She had become a frequent guest, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the values the restaurant now embodied. This time, she came alone, her elegant demeanor as striking as ever. James was the first to greet her, his smile genuine and warm. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter," he said. "It's always a pleasure to see you." Mrs. Carter smiled back, her eyes twinkling. "Good evening, James. I hear you've been doing great things." James chuckled, a hint of embarrassment coloring his tone. "Just trying to do my part." Mrs. Carter's gaze softened. "And you're doing it well." As James led her to her table, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just about redemption anymore, it was about building something lasting, something meaningful. Toward the end of the evening, Mrs. Carter called James over. She had finished her meal and was sipping a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "James," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "I want to talk to you about something important." James nodded, his attention fully on her. "Of course, Mrs. Carter. What's on your mind?" She set her teacup down and leaned forward slightly. "You've come a long way, and I'm proud of the person you've become. But I want to challenge you to think about what's next. How can you take what you've learned here and use it to make an even bigger impact?" James frowned, considering her words. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've been so focused on improving myself and helping the team that I haven't thought much about the future." Mrs. Carter smiled, her expression encouraging. "That's understandable. But the work you've done here is just the beginning. There are so many people out there who could benefit from your story, from your willingness to admit your mistakes and grow from them. Maybe it's time to start thinking about how you can share that journey with others." James felt a flicker of excitement and fear. The idea of stepping outside the restaurant, of sharing his story with a wider audience, was daunting. But it was also intriguing. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Thank you for believing in me." Mrs. Carter reached out and squeezed his hand. "I always have, James. And I always will." Over the next few months, James began to explore new opportunities. He started speaking at local schools and community centers, sharing his experiences and the lessons he had learned. His talks were raw and honest, and they resonated with people from all walks of life. He spoke about the importance of accountability, the power of growth, and the need for empathy and understanding. At the same time, in helping them see the potential for change within themselves. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, James sat down in the empty dining room, his body tired but his spirit full. Daniel joined him, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in hand. "You've done good, James," Daniel said, pouring them each a glass. "Really good." James smiled, his gaze drifting around the room. "It's not just me," he said. "It's everyone. This place, it's become something special." Daniel raised his glass. "To growth," he said. "And to the people who make it possible." James clinked his glass against Daniel's, a sense of contentment settling over him. The road had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. As the restaurant continued to thrive, its story became a beacon of hope and inspiration. Guests came not just for the food but for the experience, the feeling of being part of something bigger, something meaningful. And at the heart of it all was James, a man who had turned his mistakes into lessons, his regrets into action, and his journey into a legacy. And Mrs. Carter? She watched it all with quiet pride, knowing that her faith in James had been well placed. She had always believed in the power of change, and now, she had the proof. The restaurant had become more than just a place to dine, it had become a symbol of redemption, growth, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.